أهلا وسهلا بالجميع. إذا حدا عايز interpretation فيكن موجودة متوفرة من الإنجليزي للعربي. تكبسوا على interpretation icon تحت الشاشة. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. We're very happy to launch this series on contentious politics and social movements in the region. We have been following social movements in the region for a few years now. We've been mapping collective actions in Jordan, Tunisia, and Lebanon, and complementing, of course, the quantitative research with qualitative outputs. For us, this falls into and under the social justice program. We're very happy to start this series of webinars and this first session that will look into the trends and the trajectories of regional contentious politics in the region. We have an amazing lineup of researchers with us. Dr. Michele Scala will be moderating, and I'll give him the floor in just a moment. Dr. Michele Scala is part of our team at our center. He's also an associate professor at Sciences Po Lyon and an associate researcher at IFPO. Michele?
Yes. Hi, thank you. Hi to everybody. Marhaba bikum. I'm very thrilled to have the opportunity to moderate this first discussion held within the framework of this Lebanon support webinar cycle tackling political and social contention trajectories during and after the first wave of Arab uprisings that emerged since the winter 2010-2011. So today we will have 3 presentations of about 20 minutes each, and I would like to thank in advance the speakers to stick to the time limit in order to leave space for what I'm sure will be a vibrant discussion. So I will immediately pass to the presentation of our speakers, and while I hope that Stade du Liban will allow us, and especially all those connecting from Lebanon, to have a smooth discussion with no power cuts. As per our speakers, so Professor Andrea Teti is going to take the floor as the first speaker. Andrea Teti is an associate professor at Aberdeen University in Scotland. He will be providing a reflection about the role of socioeconomic and social justice related issues throughout Arab uprisings, while Dr. Daniel Tavana is a research fellow at the Institute for Advanced in Toulouse at Université Toulouse 1 Capitole. He will be focusing on the role of electoral and legislative institutions in encouraging or limiting positive political change, while Dr. Rossana Tufaro and Dr. Stephanie Daher are members of the research team here at Lebanon Support and will be providing an analysis on the ongoing Lebanon Support program aiming at mapping collective actions in the region. As per today's discussion, there will be mapping collective actions in Tunisia and Jordan in particular, comparing trends and trajectories. So just a logistic thing before we start. Kindly notice that we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations of the speakers. So I will be actually gathering questions from the public throughout the webinar. Feel free to write your questions directly into the chat. I will try to pick them up at the end of the presentation. So thank you everybody for attending this webinar. Dear Professor Andrea, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to everyone for coming, and to Rossana, to you, Michele, and to Stephanie. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm also looking forward to this very much. I'm also quite notorious for going on tangents, so please, you know, when I get close to the time limit, wave at me and tell me that I'm talking too much, as a typical Italian. Anyway, so my remit was to talk about the main trends and trajectories that connected to contentious politics, and the way that I thought, and then also to comment a little bit on the question of social justice, and on let's say the why we can't think in dichotomous terms about, you know, Arab Spring, winter, or Islamist spring, winter, all this kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say two types of things. First of all, look at the conditions for the uprisings in 2010, 2011, and comment on how these have changed or not changed since the uprisings, which, you know, gives us a foundation to then think about the so-called second wave of protests in places like Algeria, Sudan, etc. And I'm going to do this because probably most of us present in the meeting do mostly kind of what in political science is probably called field work. Yeah, in other words, interviews, participant observation, etc. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do something which makes me usually quite unpopular, which is to use survey data, right? Now, with all the qualifications of the case, so of course, we're very familiar with the doubts, objections, sensitivities, difficulties around carrying out public opinion surveys in the Middle East or in most authoritarian contexts. But safe to say, I mean, of course, if you're interested in this, please do feel free to ask questions, or I can refer you to some of the publications specifically on methodology that we've done as part of the Arab Transformations Project, which was 2013 to 2016, was a EU project and so on, and a bunch of publications that we come up with afterwards. So if you're a methods geek, there's stuff for you. But what we're interested in here is that at a national level, so without going into too much detail, these data are about as accurate and as public opinion survey data can be, representative at a national level. And I think what's interesting is what emerges from this is how similar some of the conclusions that emerge from this data are compared to the kinds of things that we see at a relatively more micro/qualitative level in carrying out field research. Normally, I tend to think that my instinct is that if different sources of evidence point in the same direction, then we're probably onto something. So the reason why I'm talking about survey data, aside from the fact that I've been doing this for the last 6 years of my life, is that I think it's an extra tool or trick or instrument that sometimes I think those of us who work in more interpretive or qualitative, especially post-positivist traditions, we tend to miss, and we really shouldn't. It's there for us, and we should use it. The second type of thing that I'm going to do is to comment on the combination of domestic and international and non-domestic, so regional and global factors that led to the retrenchment, authoritarian retrenchment, whether we want to talk about it in terms of revision, restoration, or counter-revolution. That's an open debate, and we can absolutely talk about that in the so what the nature of the opposition to the uprisings was/is. And in particular there, what I'm going to do is focus on the role of the European Union, which is what I've spent most of the last several years doing analyses of, especially discourse analysis of. And I'm going to try and give a sense of the connection between the conception of democracy, security, development, or the economic realm that European policymakers have, and that leads them to think about and react to the uprisings in a certain way, especially demands to social justice, social rights, and economic rights, and a series of contingent factors like the question of immigration/refugee crisis around 2013-15 that was felt in the European Union, with all the inverted the scare quotes that particular word crisis deserves. And bringing all of these things together, then I'm going to suggest that actually maybe a Gramscian perspective is quite useful in thinking, putting all these sets of factors together. In other words, the domestic and the regional and the international. And Gramsci tends to be quite popular these days. So, anyway, but he's also extremely useful. So first set of things, underlying causes of the uprisings. I'm not going to present you with specific slides, data, etc. All of that is available either online, you can Google it and find it, or I can send you the slides. Anyone who's interested in them, or the publications as policy briefs if you're working for policymakers that don't have a great attention span, or there are articles, working papers, books, if you're feeling particularly masochistic on this stuff. Now, one of the things that emerged quite quickly and strongly from the surveys that were carried out by the Arab Transformations Group in late 2014, and the latest survey was in the Algerian survey that in January 2015, so a couple of years after the uprisings, but is borne out if you look at all the other major surveys, Arab Barometer, World Value Survey, Afrobarometer in some countries, is the importance of corruption, right? So if you ask people questions like, what drove you to support passively or actively the uprisings? If you ask questions like, what do you think the main priority for your country is? And what do you think is the main even factor in the conception of democracy that people have? The struggle against corruption, the problem of corruption, is by far the single most important variable, right? Now, what we did was we grouped those variables together by those answers that pertain to social and economic rights, to civil and political rights, and to corruption and to basic services, right? Now, the reason why we had corruption to the side is, of course, because being by magnitude, by orders of magnitude, the single biggest variable, if you stick it into any of the civil, political, or social economic, if you define, in other words, corruption in one of these senses and not the other, you skew the data very, very strongly. And so if you, for example, if you included it in the socioeconomic category, then you would essentially be lending ammunition in an unwarranted fashion to those who say, well, see, the uprisings were not about democracy, they were just about jobs, because Arabs don't care about democracy. That kind of cultural inimical or this representation of the region as being inimical to democracy in some sense, right? So essentially you would help the process of reorientalization of the interpretation of the uprisings. And likewise, if you put it in civil and political, under civil and political, you would skew the data in a different direction. So it's independently, it's there. But what it does do, I think the better interpretation of the significance of corruption is the sense in a sense, the way in which, some of the slogans of the most popular slogans of the uprisings were telling us, right, intuitively. When people say Isqat al-Nidam, that people demand the downfall of the regime, it's not like they're talking about Ben Ali. It wasn't just Ben Ali dégage, right? It wasn't just Mubarak that was the problem. It's the Nidam, it's the entire system. And by the way, I'm originally from, I was born and grew up in Naples. And for those of you who know Italy, you might know this, but the local form of organized crime, the Camorra, right? It's known as Camorra to people outside of it, but inside it, it's often known as o sistema, the system. Why? Because it's all encompassing. So it's where the state is absent, the o sistema takes control of all aspects of social and economic life. Of course, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the point is that it's known as a system. So it's the system that doesn't work. And that, as a Neapolitan, this is one of the things that struck me. And it sounds to me as though if you do, field work, and if you look at the quantitative survey data, this is the dimension that emerges. So much so, for example, that if you look at, one of the other tropes of the uprisings was, oh, it's a youth revolution, right? But this is actually not true at all. If you look at the data, at least, according to survey data. So survey data tells us that the people who supported the uprisings actively or passively, within each, so between countries, there are differences in terms of major demographic components. So in some countries, more young people supported, more chronologically young people supported rather than more educated people and so on. But within each country, there's no really significant difference in any of these major demographic indicators. So what does this mean? That support for the uprisings, passive or active, came from all sectors of society. What does this mean? It means that the failure of the regimes was, it wasn't the failure, for example, to provide jobs to youth. It was a failure of the system as a whole, right? So systemic failure, again, this emerges from this other kind of data. Then if you look at, one of the classic objections that you sometimes hear, especially in policy discussions, is, well, but if you look at the standard batteries of questions on trust, do you trust the army, the police, the state institutions, parliament, etc.? What you find is that often the army and or the police get very high levels of trust, 60, 70, 80%, even in very unexpected places like Tunisia or Egypt. Right, so the police, for example, in Tunisia gets quite low levels of trust, but the army quite high. In Egypt, for example, the survey that we did, but this is not untypical, where it's possible to ask the question, do you trust the army, do you trust the police? Then you get also these high levels of trust that for field researchers look weird, because that's not our experience of the way people react to these kinds of institutions in our reality, as on the field, as it were, in the field, as it were. Part of that puzzle can be explained when you look at not the superficial symbolic representation of the state, for example, in Egypt, the army, but I talk in semiotic terms, so the association between the army and the state, the national reputation and so on. If you look at the data on, for example, on satisfaction on what the state does, what's the bread and butter of what a state should do, providing education, healthcare, etc., water, energy, all this kind of stuff. The levels of satisfaction are drastically low. I think, if I remember correctly, in the 2014 survey, but again, this is not untypical of other surveys that have been carried out since in the last 20 years. I think only in Jordan, satisfaction with basic services goes above 30%. So these are drastically low levels. So whereas people might be saying, oh yes, I trust the army, I trust the institutions of state to some extent, but then if you ask them, okay, but are you happy with what they're actually doing? the levels of response fall drastically. So that tells us that, again, there's something wrong at a systemic level in these regimes. And I think, in a way, again, without being overly simplistic about it, but if you think about some of the slogans that were extremely popular in 2010, 2011. When people call for bread, freedom, and social justice, what is that if not an incipient condemnation? Of course, it's explicitly intended as such, of a system that marginalizes you, takes away your voice, both at a political level and at a socioeconomic level. So the inequalities grow at both of these levels, right? So in that context, for example, to call for a struggle against corruption, to call for social justice, to call for respecting social and economic rights, or some of the difficult civil and political rights, like the right to association, the right to protest, etc. To call for these things is I would even say a revolutionary act, right? Because of course it sounds as though these are small, these are elements of a particular system and so on. But if you pull away at that thread, it's the system itself that falls down. So much so that I remember seeing some of the posters in the Algerian protests in 2019 made this extremely clear. It's not just about the leadership of the army. It's all of you people. It's the system itself that we're protesting against. So, I think that the message that comes, of course, like I was saying beforehand, this kind of reflection will not be new. How much time do I have, by the way? 5 minutes? Because I put on the timer, but of course I forgot to start it. So this is not going to be new for anyone who does any kind of field research, right? But often these kinds of aspects these kinds of reflections are missed or underestimated in A, the political science literature, and B, the orthodox liberal political science literature, and B, in policy discussions. So I know maybe people have other experiences, but my personal experience is that sometimes, the typical thing that is done in these kinds of contexts is that issues pertaining to social and economic rights are actually understood and framed as questions of social, economic, or outcomes of social and economic policy, right? So they're macroeconomic or policy issues, they're not questions of rights. And typically, and now I'm going to start talking about the second set of factors, so an international reaction. Let's look at the European Union, because the European Union does this and the great thing about the EU is that all the documentation is online, so it's very easy to do discourse analysis and stuff, and then do interviews and so on. So one of the striking things about the conception of democracy that you get, but again, you see this if you look at the development, the conception of development as well, is that the idea of social and economic rights, which is on the one hand claimed to be integral to the idea of human rights and therefore, and thus integral to democracy. So very often in the kind of strategy documents that the European Union has put out, especially in the period 2011 to 2015, there's a very strong statement in the preambles that says, democracy and human rights must be understood as undifferentiated, as undivided. And for me, I mean, for anyone who comes, especially, for example, from the democracy, the critical approaches to democracy and the literature on human rights law, for example, it's clear that human rights are either all of them or none of them, because otherwise they lose meaning as human rights, as universal human rights, blah, blah, blah. Of course, that notion could be contested, but that's by the by. We're taking the discourse, the rhetoric on its own terms. So that rhetoric says democracy, human rights, inseparable human rights. And to me, that means civil and political as well as social and economic. But typically what happens in these documents is that social and economic rights are rephrased, they're conceptualized, not even rephrased, they're simply presented as matters of social and economic policy outcomes, right? And there's a fundamental, it seems like a relatively small thing, but actually it's radical in its implications. Why? Because first of all, not just does it represent the idea of a classical liberal market democracy, it revalidates that implicitly, because what are you going to focus on in terms of democracy then? You're going to focus on things like voting and freedom of speech and freedom of the press that are that politically speaking are easier to support, right? Especially, I'm talking for Western governments, and also fig leaf support from autocratic regimes, by which I mean also some European countries. But anyway, so first of all, you do that, but then there's something else that happens also at a discursive level, at a conceptual level, when I reframe, these issues, these questions as economic issues and not as rights. If I have a right, then my counterpart has a duty to respect and to play their part in implementing, fulfilling those rights, or at least stopping doing things that impede fulfilling that right. But so it's in other words, from the right holder, it becomes a form of leverage, politically at least, right? However, if instead of being understood as questions of rights, they are understood as questions of aid, trade, finance, foreign direct investment, etc., then I no longer have that right, and you no longer have the duty, at least moral, if not political, to exercise to do your part. You're doing me a favor, right? By investing, by trading, by having these economic agreements and so on and so forth. So the moral economy is completely different. Okay, so that's one of the things that and then also when you think about protests against, for example, in Tunisia, for example, the protests that we've seen in Egypt and elsewhere, and these protests focus on social and economic questions, they're immediately framed as economic policy issues. Sorry, stop. And the democratic credentials and value of those protests is immediately swept to one side, as it were. So they're delegitimized, and this is why you hear a lot of talk about anti-politics or anti-democratic or non-democratic protests, etc. Right? Then, of course, in addition to that, there are two other sets of factors, and then I conclude. First, let's say, again, at a global Euro-American level, there are, I don't want to call them geopolitical interests, because I think that there's an error in the pursuit or a misrepresentation of the pursuit of so-called national interest, especially in European countries. But the role of the defense industry, you see this very clearly in countries, the foreign policies of countries like Italy and France, where in the Mediterranean, especially in the case of Italy, the Italian foreign policy has essentially been hijacked by Finmeccanica, Leonardo, Fincantieri, and especially Eni. You see this particularly clearly in the kind of Egyptian, Libyan context. And secondly, a domestic factor in the European Union, which is the alt-right fetishization of the question of immigration and terrorism and security. And you see this extremely clearly in European foreign policy between 2013, the coup in Egypt, and 2015, the validation of the coup again in Egypt, and the kind of crackdowns, or the mass murder of Rabat, etc. The final point that I want to make is the role of regional powers. We know very well the role that GCC countries, in particular Saudi, the Emirates, and Qatar played, especially the first two, in kind of counter-revolutionary keys. One micro instance for all, on the 9th of February of 2011, a couple of days before Mubarak was resigned, McCain, who is still head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the US Senate, John McCain, came out of a meeting, said, well, maybe we might think about the possibility of linking some of the funding that goes to the Egyptian state, not the military, conditioning some of that to certain conditions of human rights. An incredibly bland statement, yes? But the following morning, the Saudis put out a statement saying, even if the US withdraws every single penny of its funding to Egypt, which is roughly 5-6 billion US every year, we will replace it. Now, that tells you two things. First of all, the Saudis have had a lot of spare cash that they could find overnight. Secondly, that they're incredibly scared of and fragile to even the mere possibility of a genuine democratic move in a country like Egypt. But of course, we see this also in the way that they relate to the Tunisian question. So putting together all of the, and I should say one more thing. This pattern of focus on certain civil and political rights, not on social and economic rights, and reframing social and economic issues make a lot of sense. Yes, of course, in terms of the kind of cognitive or the semiotic landscape lenses through which policymakers and politicians discuss the question of democracy support, etc. But more importantly, it makes sense in terms of domestic European politics, okay? Because the impossibility of the discursive, cognitive, political impossibility of supporting social and economic rights as integral in themselves and as integral to democracy is dictated first and foremost by the fact that those rights have been eroded inside Europe itself, right? So the role of things like discussions over security, terrorism, and immigration in the European context, it's used in order to justify support, the return to justify support to authoritarian regimes, which in reality destabilize their own sort of countries. They don't stabilize them at all if we look a little bit more closely at the data. This is part of what the original data that I discussed is telling us. But not only that, but it helps cover up the division between what Gramsci would call dominant and subaltern groups inside Europe itself. So in fact, the question of migration specifically, what that does is it presents two subaltern groups in Europe as enemies, as class, and dare I say class enemies, subaltern groups in other countries, in paesi extracomunitari, the global south. They present them as a threat, whereas in fact, they're both sets of groups are being exploited by the same sorts of forces. So if you put all of this stuff together, then it becomes, I think, easier to understand First of all, why these factors, like I was saying originally, are continuous. They're present before, during, and after the original wave of the uprisings, and they're present now for the second wave of the uprisings. But not only that, but also it helps us understand what how it has been made possible to return to orientalizing the uprisings, either directly or through the question of migration and security, because ultimately it's functional in both sets of political policy locales. So thank you very much. I think I went a little bit over, but thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Andrea, for this very insightful discussion. So we will get back to you, of course, during the Q&A session. Now I will give the floor to Daniel Tavana. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Lebanon Support, Rossana and Stephanie and Leah for the invitation and for hosting this event. It's really nice to see so many people here, and I'm eager to see more of the findings that I know Stephanie and Rossana are going to talk about, and eager to hear the group's questions. I think my comments and what I want to talk about kind of stems nicely from Andrea's comments, insofar as I'm going to talk a little bit about the electoral constraints specifically facing oppositional forces in the post-2011 period. And so moving from the events of the Arab Spring until to the present, with a view towards, I hope, introducing some of the work that Stephanie and Rossana are going to present in a little bit. So what I'll do is I'll first, I want to kind of share a couple historical insights and maybe go back even earlier than the Arab Spring period. And I'll try not to spend too much time on this. I then kind of want to problematize a little bit what we mean by opposition, and how we kind of use that word, and what work we're doing when we use that word, and who we're doing that work for. And perhaps some of what I'll have to say will kind of come through in Stephanie and Rossana's comments. But more to the point, what I want to do is highlight three big post-2011 trends. Some of these may appear obvious in the sense that they're kind of well known, or we might assume them to be true, but I think I want to put these out there because I think that sometimes even things that may be obvious require empirical assessment or validation, more interrogation, and I think that's exactly what Stephanie and Rossana are going to do for us later. My hope is that identifying some of these kind of bigger trends at a macro or let's say regional level, informed by a qualitative understanding of the cases in the region, will allow us to kind of use the data that Lebanon Support has been collecting to kind of test some of these assumptions or ideas out. And so the kind of big three, just to preview what I'll say, first, I think big picture, there is increasing frustration with formal institutions of the state, and a lot of frustration with pre-existing pathways for reform specifically. And by this, I mean organized opposition groups are often targeted in collective action, protest, as much as the state, or as often. And I think that this is a relatively new phenomenon over the past 30 years. The second is the rise of independence. And I'll say a little bit about what I mean by independence, but increasingly I think new actors are a part of it, but actors unaffiliated with pre-existing political parties are entering the sort of political scene in a lot of different places in interesting and I think innovative ways. And I don't think that that's really appreciated at a regional level necessarily, and we don't really have a good way of thinking about that. And then last, I think, is sort of the expansion of repression and coercion, right? And I think this is the most obvious one. Andrea talked a lot about this in his comments. And again, I pose this here because I think just saying that there has been an expansion of repression and coercion is sort of obvious and makes sense, and is consistent, I think, with what's happening in a lot of countries in the region. But what's great about the data that Lebanon Support is collecting is it actually allows us to kind of take a look under the hood at, who are the new targets? Are they new targets of this repression and coercion, and where is this happening and in what way? And so that's sort of what I want to do with that. So thinking about, to begin with sort of like a kind of historical overview of elections, there's obviously been a long history of electoral competition in the Middle East. This is, of course, dating back to at least the end of the 19th century in Egypt through to the 1920s and 1930s in Egypt, when there were relatively, although controlled, free and fair elections in this period relative to what was happening elsewhere. And then, of course, there were kind of a string of elections in the post-war period in Syria and Lebanon and also elsewhere that were generally a bit open, I would say more open than elections are in many places now. But in earnest, when we think of elections in the region, we kind of think back to the late 1980s and the early 1990s, when hopes for, let's call it democratization and the expansion of civil and political rights in the region gave some hope to activists or different actors in the region that these kind of openings would lead to greater democracy, or at least more accountable representative governance. And I think often when we think about the history and the sequencing of these events, we don't really talk about this period and how it itself was the product of contentious action and mobilization in the 1980s that spurred this kind of reaction by the state. And so what am I talking about here? Specifically, we can think in Tunisia of Ben Ali signing the National Pact in 1988, parliamentary elections held in 1989, King Hussein holding elections in Jordan in 1989, the first elections in over 20 years, the Taif Agreement, which sort of mandated elections in 1992, unification of Yemen, which resulted in elections in 1993, the liberation of Kuwait, elections in 1992, and then of course there's elections, a new electoral law in Morocco in 1993, Oslo in the same period, Mubarak's national dialogue in 1994, which sort of was designed in part to use liberal forces in elections to kind of counter rising Islamist electoral hegemony. And so I raise these events to show, not just to kind of give a history lesson, but to say that this state response was very much, these kind of state-driven reforms, if you want to call them that, or the institution of elections and the greater participation of opposition was itself a reaction to the events of the 1980s, right? And we didn't know in the late 1980s, or early, maybe some people did, that this was how the state would respond, right? And so I think when we're looking at contentious action and different forms of protest and mobilization now, thinking about possible, in what ways the state will respond, and in some places it's responded pretty decisively already, I think the picture is actually a bit darker, right? And I think this is something we need to think about. Often when we think of the Arab Spring, we kind of think of it as like, and not to repeat what Andrea, I think, already said so eloquently, we tend to think of it as a sort of rupture, like a sequence of transformative events or a moment before which there was nothing and after which there were outcomes that were worthy of understanding or studying. But to emphasize a theme that I think is central to the work that Lebanon Support is doing and the data that you've all started to painstakingly collect, when we as scholars, activists, observers, or whatever, impose a set of categories, concepts, or kind of outcome, a temporal finality to something like the Arab Spring, we're in many ways doing the work of the regimes themselves. And so it makes a lot more sense to look at government opposition contention as a historical process, something that kind of ebbs and flows over time, right? And, again, and I'll say this a lot, our data, the data that Lebanon support and Stephanie and Rossana have taken so much time to collect allows us to kind of do just this, right? This is, of course, not to say that categories and concepts are not useful. On the contrary, these categories and concepts allow us to do the important scientific work of making comparisons, communicating our findings to other social scientists, the public, and so on. But I do think it's worth emphasizing as a cautionary note, what I think, what I think the limits of both the limits and some of the benefits of this kind of data collection are. On that note, I think it's, and I'll take a brief detour into my own work on the meaning of opposition. I do want to say a couple things about how we use this word and what it means, and to kind of problematize it in ways that I think, again, with a view towards looking at some of the data and looking more seriously at some of the patterns of mobilization will kind of help us maybe make sense of this word. What do we mean by opposition, right? And so let me give a few examples of the problem. Is the Islamist PJD political party in Morocco opposition, right? Can we call this group an opposition group if it's in government? Up until recently, the prime minister belonged to the political party. To use an example from Lebanon, is Hizb al-Kataib opposition, right? I know some people would cringe at even that suggestion, or even Lebanese forces, right? But these are groups that often refer to themselves as opposition. And they, of course, do so strategically, perhaps even cynically sometimes. But I raise these points, I think, to sort of suggest that, what we mean by opposition is not clear. Often when we kind of use this word, we're speaking across conceptual registers, and simple answers, conceptual questions like, can an opposition movement participate in government? Is it still opposition if it does so? Does it cease to be opposition if it's in government? Can it go back, right? And in some of my own work, I define opposition as a group of elites who initiate routine, public, and goal-oriented activities in formal institutions of the state, when those activities aim to do usually one of two things, right? Limit the extent to which state institutions can implement the policy prerogatives of the ruling coalition, or remove or limit the ruling coalition's control over state institutions themselves. And so I think I kind of, in my work, draw a boundary here between groups that are sort of working within the system and groups that are working from outside it, often using more subversive, occasionally violent tactics designed to sort of, overthrow the regime. And I think that this boundary is important when we think of different kind of patterns of mobilization too, right? And thinking about what those goals are. More to the point, I want to kind of spend the last 10 minutes or so of my comments highlighting the kind of big three post-2011 trends that I see. And of course, there are many more. And I've put these out here just because I guess I'm interested to know how they bear out in the data, whether or not they do. And Rossana and Stephanie can tell me if I'm wrong, or perhaps, there are others, and we can talk about those in the Q&A as well. The first, as I mentioned, the reason that there's increasing frustration with formal institutions of the state, particularly institutions that are designed to channel kind of opposition, grievances, and frustration into some sort of productive or responsive policy output. The reasons for this are many, but as Andrea kind of gave an overview, a lot of the reliable public opinion data we have suggests that in general, citizens are less trusting of government, far more skeptical of political parties, much more concerned with growing corruption. Of course, growing concern with corruption is also a product of increasing levels of corruption. The predatory behavior of political elites, right? These are all trends that we see in public opinion data that also kind of manifest themselves in different ways in forms of contentious action. So we see, for example, fewer protests, and again, here I'm speaking kind of broadly, qualitatively, in hopes that our friends at Lebanon Support can tell me if I'm right or wrong, but fewer protests related to big transnational causes or political events. In many ways, protests are becoming much more local than they may have been in recent years. The targeting of opposition and protests themselves, this sort of like weakness or ineptitude of the opposition. I'm thinking here of recent protests in 2017 and 2018 in Iran, where opposition elites were targeted by protesters. Iraq, of course, recently, and to a lesser extent, protests in Sudan and Algeria. Protests are increasingly protesters and protest movements, given their sort of fragmented kind of nature, are increasingly negotiating directly with different governments. Because they have both because these movements have no expectation that other oppositional elites will take care of them, right? So I'm thinking of the teachers' strike in Jordan, for example. And because for the regime, it's less costly to do so. And so this, I think, is interesting, and I'd be curious to hear more about this in some of the data as well. And I think, related to some of this kind of frustration with pre-existing institutions or pre-existing kind of oppositions, right? There's been a rise of alternative kind of civil movements, right? So there's been a wave of femicide in Kuwait, for example, a country that I work on. And this kind of rise of femicide has created a number of different civil movements that often work together in order to raise awareness about the rise of femicide and the nature of these killings, with, again, a view towards pushing different state institutions, with a view towards sort of operating outside of pre-existing state institutions to kind of make different citizens or groups aware of these events. The second big picture kind of trend, that I think has kind of shaped these electoral dynamics is the rise of independence, right? And so here I'm thinking of independent actors who are not members of traditional political parties, whether or not these political parties are supported or connected to the state or the opposition, right? And so in some sense, this is in some ways a global phenomenon. We can call it, populism, anti-elites, establishment. I would hesitate to use that word in the Middle East, but this is not sort of unique to the Middle East in terms of just its newness. It's a consequence of some of the above kind of frustrations with status quo elites, status quo institutions that I mentioned. And it's also a product of new forms of media, not to overstate this, but where people, of course, have direct access to non-traditional or new actors in ways that they didn't have before, right? And this, of course, was itself one of often cited as the literature as something that was important to the Arab Spring. And so it's interesting to see how it's kind of manifested itself now. Some recent examples in Kuwait, where, again, a country I work on closely, where independents and newcomers have done particularly well in elections. Tunisia, right? Kais Saied is not part of a traditional political party, is himself considered an independent and often presents himself as sort of being above the fray of political parties. Of course, the consequences of this, we can discuss in more detail. Even in a place like Lebanon, political parties strategically use independence for their own kind of purposes. So I'm thinking, for example, of somebody like Ziad Hawat, the former mayor of Jebel, who is has historically kind of billed himself as a political independent, though of course he's very close to one particular political party, as is known, but that independence is sort of important to the brand and to the appeal, right? And so this was very common in recent elections in Lebanon, where political parties were strategically able to attract different types of independents in sort of encouraging them to run on their lists. In Morocco, the National Rally of Independence went in recent elections, won 102 seats from 37 seats recently. Of course, the PJD itself, the Islamist PJD party, went from 125 to 13 seats. And this resulted again in the kind of rise of an independent Aziz Akhanouch as prime minister, who himself is not tied, generally to a specific political party and has something of an independent kind of approach to politics. And again, this is not to kind of paint all of these actors with this broad kind of brush or label of independence, but these are new actors that are don't necessarily have kind of ties to existing status quo parties. Just to wrap up, and I have a couple other examples here, but I want to make sure we have enough time for the findings. The last big kind of big sort of trend is this expansion of repression, right? And I don't think I need to say a whole lot about this because Andrea spoke about it. And I know in some of the data, we'll take a look and hear about different state responses to grievances, contentious action, protests, and so on. But I do think that aside from imposing greater costs on anti-system opposition in particular, repression has become more violent, more decisive, of course, not just in places like Egypt or Tunisia, where police repression has been a significant kind of factor in mobilization, but even in a place like Kuwait, where revocation of citizenship is sort of this very heavy-handed tactic that's used. This is, of course, used elsewhere in the Gulf as well. There was recently a pardon in progress in Kuwait of a number of opposition members who are in Turkey. Increasing repression in Iran, right, has resulted in the disqualification of dozens of opposition MPs and elites from participating in elections, right? And so even beyond the kind of case of Egypt, which we hear a lot about, this is again happening in lots of different places and in different ways. And so the data that Lebanon Support has collected will allow us to kind of look at this, I hope, a little bit more systematically from the perspective of anti-system kind of activism and protest participation. I will stop there. I'm very happy to be here, looking very forward to Stephanie and Rosanna's interventions and of course comments. So I'll turn it back over to you all.
Thank you, Daniel, for the rich discussion. So we go straight to the presentation of Rosanna and Stephanie. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michele. Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here with you today, albeit virtually, in this first of a series of the scheduled webinars of Lebanon Support. Given the time constraint, I will try to be as brief as possible so that we allow also some space for the Q&A at the end of the session. So in this panel, my colleague and Dr. Rosanna Tufaro and I will be presenting some data about the trends and trajectories which were identified given the mappings we have produced with Lebanon Support on Jordan and Tunisia. But before that, let me provide you just with a brief overview of the mappings which are produced by the center. So the mappings currently cover contentious mobilizations and collective actions in 3 countries, which are Lebanon, Jordan, and Tunisia. They are based on an exclusive typology which takes into consideration mobilizing actors, spatial characteristics, the state response, and so forth. And it relies on an exhaustive list of sources such as media reports, NGO reports, and as well as first-hand reports. As for the time span, it differs across the 3 countries. For instance, at Lebanon, it dates back to, if I'm not mistaken, to November 2017 up until our current days. In Tunisia, it extends back to December 2019, and we are working hopefully a bit of extending backwards the period given its relevance. And in Jordan, it starts from mid-2018. So for all the the attendees who are interested in looking at the data and in trying to understand the trends and trajectories, I encourage you to go and visit the mappings and also the digest which we have produced on this. Okay, so let's start with Tunisia, the lone democratic success story of the Arab uprisings, as it is widely praised and known. So where does Tunisia today in terms of contentious mobilization stand? What trends and trajectories regarding the waves of collective actions can be identified? So as I have anticipated, I will be focusing specifically on the period extending from December 2019 until September 2021. Just let me a small disclaimer on the methodology of the mappings, given especially the complexity at the level of Tunisia, especially in the first quarter of 2021, given that the mobilizations extended over several days across several regions. So I would like to let you know that, for instance, we have relied on codifying the protests or the contentious mobilizations which are taking place across several cities. They were quantified as one, with obviously the specification of the regions or the cities or even neighborhoods in which they are taking place. Another thing, for instance, is that the mode of action. So for instance, as if a contentious mobilization took the form of a road blockade together with a march or together with a demonstration, they were quantified as one. So this just to let you understand a bit about the methodology, because it might differ across several mappings. So how can we characterize, let's say, the period extending from December 2019 until September 21? Primarily, and one thing which needs to be outlined is the high degree of geographic decentralization, where protests extended over almost all of the 24 governorates in Tunisia. We are talking here about rural areas. We are talking about southern regions. We are talking about protests which included several working class neighborhoods in urban peripheries as well. So protests did not take place at all, only in Tunis, and even at the level of Tunis, at the capital, they took place across several working class neighborhoods, and not only the usual mainstream places of protest. Second, a high proportion were persistent. What do I mean by this? I mean that they lasted for several weeks, they extended over several nights, and in some cases weeks, like what happened actually from the 14th of January 2021 until mid-March, despite the implementation of COVID measures. The third point I would like to outline is the geospatial solidarity. What do I mean by this is that it is a remarkable feature of these mobilizations, the solidarity which existed between one region and the other. So a lot of the protests, a lot of protesters actually stood in solidarity and protested with other activists or with other collective and informal groups in other regions. This also increased, especially with the series of arrests which took place in January, but I will come back to this later. I would like now to zoom in on the, let's say, the periodical timeline and focus on three triggers which played a major role in the increase and the intensification of the contentious mobilizations which took place across Tunisia. So in March 2020, and upon the government's implementation, or let's say announcement of the governmental, about the COVID imposed measures, instead of producing a reducing effect, it did it did the country. So it produced a counter reaction where widespread protests in the country extended all over the country, calling for the government to provide financial aid in recompense for their loss of essential income. And this is particularly important because in this period, a lot of youth and unemployed youth mobilized during this period, given also that they rely on the informal economy of Tunisia. What do I mean by this is that a lot of their sources of income and employment comes from the informal economy, which is characterized as unregulated with no social protection. So obviously with the spread of the pandemic and the implementation of the COVID measures, their only source of income and basic food supplies was practically eliminated. Then moving on, and with the, let's say, acceleration of the economic crisis, it triggered obviously further increase in protests. And I also outline here that was mostly led by unemployed young people. This was also compounded with the state's attempt, or let's say response, to introduce a law or to pass it in the parliament regarding which grants security officers impunity, or in other words, it grants them immunity from prosecution. Particularly here, I'm talking about the October 2020 and widespread protests here extended all over the country. We can talk here about the rise also of a youth-led movement known as Hasibhum, or the translation, hold them to account or hold them accountable, obviously to try to stop and block the passing of this law, which grants immunity and security for the police forces in Tunisia. Then we witnessed here, let's say, a very rapid acceleration and increase in the protest starting from the 14th of January 2021, which marks actually the 10-year commemoration of the Tunisian revolution. And it also coincided with the government's announcement of a 4-day lockdown. And from this day up, moving to 6 weeks after it, continuous mobilizations took place all over Tunisia. And surprisingly enough, they started not in Tunis, but they started in Kasserine, which is a Tunisian government, and soon spread to other governments such as Siliana, where a video of the police officers harassing and violating, let's say, violating the activity of a shepherd diffused on social media, and this spurred protest in relation. I will try to zoom in now on the actors and mobilizing structures. So as the mapping shows, the majority of the mobilizing actors in this period were collective and informal groups with 38%, followed by civil society organizations, moving on to political parties occupying 10% of these contentious mobilizations, and then the affected groups. I would like to outline here that the civil society organizations were youth-led, such as, for instance, the Tunisian Association for Justice and Equality, known also as DEMJ, the Tunisian Organization of Young Doctors, Al-Bawsala, iWatch organizations are just some examples of them. So what we can say is that this period, in terms of mobilizing actors, witnessed the anger of the marginalized populations, who were the same, who rose up who were the first to rise up against the Ben Ali regime back in 2011. And in this, the unemployment reported rates are highly vocal. What do I mean by this is that if we look at the statistics of the National Institute of Statistics, the unemployment rate in Tunisia rose to 17.80% post-pandemic in the fourth quarter of 2021. If we look only at youth unemployment, according to the data of the World Bank, they soared at 36.5% in 2021, which is the highest reported rate in North Africa. What we can simply say is that Tunisia's youthful population experience chronic unemployment, and hence they manifest their increasing anger and their growing frustration, obviously in contentious mobilizations. I would also like to outline here that this period witnessed as well the emergence of opposition, let's say, youth-led movements. Among them, or one of the most prominent of them, is the Wrong Generation movement, is a youth-led group. It started by launching its social media hashtag, and it clearly distances itself from the protesters, let's say, as they cite them, of the last decade, and they reject the traditional mobilizing groups, such as, for instance, the labor unions and so forth. When we come to speak of the grievances and demands, the data reveals that the protests were primarily driven by injustice and perceived injustice, with 28%, followed by policy grievances and access to socioeconomic rights, including most prominently the freedom of expression and assembly. This is particularly relevant because, as I have mentioned earlier, in January 2021, it ushered an intense wave of repression and police violence used in confrontation with the protesters, whereby in just, if I'm not mistaken, in 3 weeks, around 2,000 arrests were recorded, including many minors in Tunisia. So this is a sounding alarm to the freedom of expression, and let's say to the achievements concluded by the Tunisian revolution on this level. The perceived sense of injustice explains the dominant mobilization of the youth from popular and marginalized neighborhoods, who suffer from chronically underfunded services and poor access to education and jobs. Okay, I think, sorry, I missed the time that I have, so I will just go directly to the mode of actions to be able to leave time for Rosanna and then the Q&A. So as for the mode of actions, what was outlined is that protesters mainly resorted to demonstrations, sit-ins, road blockades, marches, and tire burnings, and they often also employed conjointly several modes of actions. One important thing is that as the frequency of security arrests increased, protesters resorted, in addition to demonstrations, to sit-ins in front of the courts in order, in solidarity with the arrestees, and to ask for demanding a fair trial for all those who were arrested. Let me just try to conclude with 3 observations which I find important to put forward. Is at the level of Tunisia, there is a growing political salience of regional economic and social inequalities and the rising strength of the marginalized population. And this takes us to say that, as it has been over the past few years, it requires a reassessment of the dynamics of contention and protest beyond, let's say, the classic institutions of political representation, such as parties and labor unions. So a focus on politically, economically, and socially marginalized populations, whether we are talking about social or spatial marginalization, I think is important in this framework. I will conclude here, and I will leave space for further questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Please, Rosanna, go ahead.
So thank you. Thanks, everyone. And also thanks, Stephanie, for having already done a methodological introduction of how are we actually collecting data. So I will go straight with some first numbers and then some insights that we can derive from these numbers as of the Jordanian case. So actually in Jordan, from September 1st, 2018 up to last Monday, more or less, we have detected about 460 contentious actions, whereof at least 15%, of them made of open-ended mobilizations, which span from a time frame of 3-4 days up to more than 3 months. The most notorious case in this sense is the teacher strike of 2019, but there have also been very long-standing protests sit-in by unemployed youth, which also overcame the length of the teacher strike, even not very much, but still. And this is deeply conflicts with the mainstream image and perception of Jordan as a socially pacified, glittering monarchy in the region. As a matter of fact, instead, as much as the neoliberal transition and the socioeconomic backlashes of this transition that is still in progress, as much as they triggered the Jordanian Spring, let's say so, in 2011, are still representing the main engine for social mobilization. And this is evident also from the fact that the overwhelming majority of mobilization for the whole triennium have been related to the demand to the access to socioeconomic rights, followed swift by policy grievances, most of them also related to socioeconomic issues. And at third position, and here this is for Tawana about the transnational solidarity, are regional grievances, most of them related to the Palestinian question for obvious historical and demographic reasons in the case of Jordan, that are still anyway worth of being underlined, because in any case, they give back an image of a popular importance of the Palestinian question conflicting with the normalization carried out by the monarchy since the 90s. And this, especially in 2020, soon before the mobilizations for the deal of the century, when mobilization for gas deals in Jordan, between Jordan and Israel, this challenging attitude of pro-Palestinian demonstration was particularly evident. While instead, for the case of Sheikh Jarrah, in last May, rather than periodically Israeli attacks on Gaza, then the situation is more nuanced, because sometimes, I mean, the Hashemite monarch must say something in solidarity, okay? But when it comes to question of policies, then some of the frictions, or at least this asymmetry between the base and the top emerge. But coming back to the roots of socioeconomic grievances. So we can see an overwhelming majority of socioeconomic related ones. Among them, the majority is represented by labor grievances, followed, so higher wages, but in defense or claim for social security benefits, job stability, because I mean, the Jordanian labor market has undergone, and this is a global trend actually, an important precarization in the past decade. And then the second major claim is the quest for social protection, which includes also, and this represents maybe the most substantial part, the quest for jobs, especially by unemployed youth, which has been sided in the past decade by the quest for a greater social protection, basically economic compensations for the pandemic, which has triggered, as much as Tunisia, a multiplication of mobilizations, despite the health containment measure and the deep securitization of the pandemic that the monarchy in Jordan has implemented. So mobilization that are occurring also in defiance of a retrenchment of the repressive dispositive in Jordan. On the other hand, of course, reflecting this type of grievances, the main actor who is mobilizing are workers' groups. And among them, there are three categories in particular. public employees, including teachers, who have represented also the most politically advanced, if we want, example of this plethora of workers group in the public sector that are mobilizing, unemployed youth, including both rural and unskilled one, and urban educated one. And the third one, and this is very interesting because it calls into question an aspect of neoliberal transition in the region that is still deeply understudied, is the transport sector. And the mobilizations in the transport sector have worked along three main trajectories. One, which started with the beginning of the pandemic, so by transport sector workers protesting or to ask for compensation for the loss of job, especially, for instance, transport workers working on transnational routes, like, I don't know, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, etc., which were very severely affected by the closure of borders. Taxi drivers, minivan drivers, because of the capacity restrictions. And so this is, okay, the COVID-related binary of the transport sector. Another one, and this is the interesting one, it's made up by the workers of the ride-hailing apps. So Uber, Careem, Talabat, etc., which are uninterruptedly mobilizing since at least 2.5 years, in turn for around three main questions that sometimes overlapped, sometimes succeeded one another over time. Okay, one, general policy grievances for, I don't know, initiated by the Ministry of Transportation, imposing the change of the car every 5 years, for instance, or a rising price of the licensing and so forth. The second one, carried out by the drivers or riders against the companies, and in the overwhelming majority of cases for rises unbargained of commission fees, asked by Uber and Careem. Yes. And the third one are this type of workers asking for help to the state to mediate them with the company. And this is creating in turn another short circuit whereby the third transport category who's mobilizing are the yellow taxi drivers, who are the licensed ones that in the past 3 years have been uninterruptedly mobilizing to ask for the state to protect them from the concurrence of Uber and Careem. And actually, this intersection of discursive plans, struggle plans, and structural plans is extremely interesting and extremely understudied. So if there is any sociologists, etc., working on Jordan and searching for inspiration for further research, ahla wa sahla. So in conclusion, what I want to say is just that it's true that, so what this mapping is, the image that this mapping gave back to us is that of a country in a profound ferment, of an Hashemite monarchy who's still deeply struggling to recraft the social, to finalize the neoliberal recrafting of its social contract with its constituencies, most notably Transjordanian, who are most employed in the public sector, and peripheral rural constituencies. And third, I mean, we must say that despite the commonalities of grievances, these mobilizations are still unfolding in a very insular way. So public school teachers are mobilizing on their own, Careem drivers are mobilizing on their own, municipal employees are mobilizing on their own, etc., etc., etc. But what we have the chance at least to test, to smell, is that if something transversal affecting all the social strata of Lebanese society occurs as of the proposed tax reform of 2018 or an accident which happened related to COVID in March, then broad-based mass mobilization on a national scale occur, and they put at the forefront of the claim broader policy grievances. So since the time is over, I would stop now. I gave, most of the input. So if we want me to go in the deep of other aspects, there's the. I just hope having been clear. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for this very, very rich and insightful discussion. So I have the opportunity to be a moderator, so maybe I have also the opportunity to ask the first questions. And I will go through several questions and comments that came from the public. Some of those you already know them because we shared them before the webinar. Some others came up now. So I maybe ask you to, to get an idea of all the questions and go through them as you wish, pick them up as you feel. So I would maybe like to start from the suggestion that Rossana was about maybe understanding or anyway investigate the neoliberal transition in the region. And in order to pick up this suggestion, I would like to link it to some of the keywords, let's say, that that came from your discussions, that are, for instance, unsatisfaction for the system, political parties, unemployment, different trends that relate, corruption, of course, different themes, that phrase a more general, maybe, fracture of the social compact, let's say. And so my question would be, how do you think that this ongoing fracture of the social compact is linked to the neoliberal transition, and how, therefore, let's say, more structural political economy issues, globalized political economy issues, actually are impacting on contentious politics trajectories in the region? How do they inform the understanding of the uprisings and different social movements, by stressing also that at the same time, if we think about 2019, 2018, 2019, pre-COVID, era and situation, this kind of claims did not only come from the region that interests us today, from Arab countries, but also from Hong Kong, from Chile, from Iran, as it was already said, and of course Algeria, Iran, Iraq, sorry, and of course Lebanon. So, this would be my first unclear question. And as a second thing, I also wanted to ask a very practical thing. How do you think that the trajectories highlighted throughout your discussions actually can inform us the Lebanese trajectory, and especially the CeSSRA trajectory in Lebanon? I don't know if you prefer to go through these two questions before and then pick up the questions from the public. How would you like to go ahead? Do you think it's already too much, maybe, to be answered? All right, I will just go.
And I think that,
yes, please.
the neoliberal linkage, I have already stressed it. So in Jordan, it's very clear. And maybe in the case of Lebanon, I will speak more in terms of a crisis of a crony neoliberal model, which triggered, upon which the sectarian social contract had been built. And then once this neoliberal crony system entered into crisis, it somehow broke the contract and ignited the uprising. If I, just to tackle the last question that you wrote.
Maybe we can have a tour de table about these questions and then go through the public questions. Yeah, we actually have really a short time, so I will be. We only have, I think, something like 5 minutes. So I will be reading some comments and questions from the public. How can we identify the socioeconomic roots of the said waves, and how does globalization impact policies in Middle East and North Africa? To what extent does the international community shape the trends on a local level? Then I will read 2 comments from public. In the absence of inadequate and equitable social security nets for all levels of the citizens, corruption will not be restricted on the governing bodies, but scales down to all levels of the community in variable ways. And also, sometimes opposition movements doesn't reflect reform intentions. It might be an opposition that is triggered on the concept, step down to sit in your place. So please, if you can answer to all of this in 1 minute each, that would be great. Thank you.
May I just comment very briefly on the question related to the extent the international community shapes these trends. I will talk about the case of Tunisia. I will comment on it. To give honestly a straightforward question, in terms of contentious mobilization, I do not think they play, let's say, a major role in that, because as we have seen, especially in the cases of Tunisia, Jordan, and also Lebanon, what the protesters are contesting collectively are socioeconomic problems and socioeconomic challenges, which they have grieved for since a long time, and that was actually what triggered the protest or the Tunisian revolution in 2011. So they have remained unaddressed, and the Camor protests, for instance, in Tunisia, which have extended over 4 years and recently have somehow arrived to a conclusion with the state, are an example, are a clear example of these grievances. In the case of Tunisia, whether we are talking about social marginalization, so economic issues, but also spatial marginalization in some regions which are known to be resource-rich regions. I conclude just with these 2. Maybe the international community shapes the discourse on the or overemphasizes and overfocuses on the significance of technical democratic requisites in the case of Tunisia, whether they were fair and continuative elections, legislative or municipal, whether we are talking about a proliferated civil society. So I think it shapes this part of the discourse more than the trends and trajectories of contentious mobilization in the countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Andrea wants to add something to all of this.
Yeah, just to say that it's not so much for example, European states, European Union, etc., are doing, but what they're not doing, right? So what they're omitting from doing. So this is the point that I was making earlier on, and it ties in with the last point that Stephanie was making, you know, that the focus on kind of technical measures, these kind of procedural, in a sense, superficial, formal understanding of democracy, as opposed to substantive understanding of democracy. What this does effectively, this is why the book that we published last year is called Democratization Against Democracy, because the measures of democratization are superficial. Actually, they go against, you know, they undermine, especially when we think, okay, it's okay, we're getting towards democracy, act first on this, and then the other stuff will come later, which it never does. What you do is you actually undermine, pressures for democratization or pressures that are compatible with democratization, right? Social justice, social and economic rights, so So what European states are doing, and this is mirrored quite closely by, so for example, if you look at the economic agendas and the language that comes out of the EU-Tunisia Association Council, look at the EU documents, the EU-Tunisia Council documents, and the language that comes out of the Tunisian government, you see this very, very close. There are some differences, but they're really, if you compare them to what people actually want, to the kinds of protests that, for example, by the way, thank you very much to Stephanie and Rossana for the mappings. I think they're absolutely brilliant, and they drive even more strongly the point that you have sensitivities, priorities, conceptions, whether they are conceived of in kind of, let's say, narrow, non-politicized, single issue protests, or whether they're considered in kind of a broader, mobilized, kind of more, to use again leftist language, like kind of, you know, politically conscious, etc. Ways. But it's clear that this is what people are doing. They're pushing in these directions, not just because they're subject to socioeconomic marginalization, but because or rather, it's not just about the specific issues. Whether this is, I mean, this is one of the interesting things I just asked Rossana and Stephanie is, do you feel that the framing, that the way in which this protest, these single issue protests are carried out, where there is no cross, geographical or issue solidarity, whether this is a tactical framing, or whether this genuinely reflects a lack of politicization, a single issue. The reason why I ask is because Gennaro Gervasio and I were doing interviews in 2009, 2008, 9, 10, before the uprisings. And one of the issues that, so, you know, we weren't thinking in that direction, but one of the issues that came up again and again, especially from labor activists, was, well, we don't really think that there's a kind of, that these are single issue protests, that they're not really, they don't really have the kind of national consciousness or political consciousness, even when referring to the famous like week-long Mahalla strikes. So I wonder whether you get the feeling that the single issue nature of or framing of the protests is really a genuine reflection of the way that this is conceived, or whether there's a kind of, you know, we're well aware that we protest on this single issue, but this single issue is representative of the failure of the system. So my point turned into a question.
Thank you, Andrea. So Daniel, do you want to add anything to this discussion so that we can conclude, because we really should leave our colleagues.
No, I think I had a similar question, just kind of hearing Rossana and Stephanie talk through some of the findings. Something that puzzled me was sort of this, I think in the data, there's like a difference between episodic kind of one-off versus continuous protest movement, continuous protest activity. And this is sort of, I mean, I guess we don't really know what things were like before the Arab Spring. I mean, we know qualitatively, we don't know from the data yet, because it doesn't go back that far. But I had a similar kind of reaction. You know, what kinds of linkages, if any, are being formed even in these one-off or episodic protests? And if none are being formed, I guess it would be interesting for me to know why, given how, you know, in some contexts, this is quite risky behavior, and the rewards are often slim. Why people both engage in these kinds of protests in greater numbers with greater frequency, but also why they don't necessarily evolve, or maybe they do, into other sort of like lasting or continuous movements. It's a similar kind of question I had, unrelated to the kind of international dynamics, but I find that kind of distinction in the work very interesting, and so just something that I'm curious about. Not to add another question to the table, but just food for thought.
Well, this is the perfect opportunity to everybody to follow the next webinars, in which we will maybe try to answer some of those questions going through these other dimensions of the contentious politics trajectories in the region. So I would really like to thank everybody, especially the speakers and the organization, but also the public. And I'm very sorry if we couldn't go through some of the questions that have been asked. I hope that this will be possible during next webinar. So thank you, everybody, and I'm looking forward to see you all at the next webinar. Thank you.